Before we get to the fruit, before we get to the bite, before we get to the blame, there is a conversation. A woman is standing in a garden. Not just any garden. A garden where every tree is good and every fruit is food, and the air has never once carried the smell of anything rotting. She has never had a nightmare. She has never watched someone she loved leave and not come back. She does not yet know what loss is, because nothing has been lost. And into this garden, into this unbroken, ungrieved, unscarred world, comes a question. Not a command, not a threat, a question. End quote. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? End quote. And here is the first thing you need to understand about this moment. The woman answers it. Theologically, she engages the question. She references the command. She adds detail. She draws a boundary. She is not passive. She is not silent. She is thinking. This is not a story about a weak woman. This is not a story about a foolish woman. This is not a story about a woman who did not care what God said. This is a story about a woman who was targeted by the most sophisticated deceiver in the history of the world and has been blamed for it ever since. There is a sentence Eve says, after everything has fallen apart, after the garden is gone, after the cost has become clear, that almost no Bible teacher ever quotes. Not in a sermon. Not at a Women and Oppos retreat. Not in 20 years of Christian content. 7 words in English. And when you hear them, they are going to change the way you see her. We will get to them. But not yet. For now, stay with the garden. Stay with the conversation. She is talking to a serpent. But the Hebrew word for what this serpent is, Aram, is not simply, end quote, evil, end quote. Aram means shrewd, cunning, crafty. It is the same root used in Proverbs to describe the wisdom of the prudent. The serpent is not a cartoon villain. He is, by the Bible and Oppos' own description, the most intelligent creature in the garden. And he has chosen his target. Here is what no one asks. Why her? Why not Adam? He is right there. The text does not say Adam is somewhere else, working in another field, unaware of what is happening. Later, in chapter 3, verse 6, the text says she gave some to her husband, who was with her. He was present. He heard the conversation, and he said nothing. So why her? Here is what the first-century Jewish historian Josephus wrote about this moment. In Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93 AD, he said the serpent approached Eve because she was the more intelligent of the two and more capable of being persuaded by rational argument. A first-century Jewish historian, looking at the same text, and his conclusion was, the serpent targeted her because she was smarter. Read that again. The attack was not on her weakness. The attack was on her mind. And here is where the entire 2,000-year conversation about Eve has gone wrong. We have spent centuries calling her gullible when the text is telling us she was targeted. We have spent centuries calling her the reason women cannot be trusted when the text is telling us she was deceived. By someone designed to deceive. By someone who had studied her, prepared for her, and came with a plan. But here is what the text actually says. And it matters. Because the word the Bible uses for what happened to her is not the word for weakness. It is not the word for foolishness. It is a completely different word. And that difference is the whole point of this video. The Hebrew word Eve uses when God asks her what happened is Nachash. N-Y-S-H-A. And Nachash does not mean, end quote, I was weak, end quote. It does not mean, end quote, I was careless, end quote. It does not mean, end quote, I gave into what I wanted, end quote. Nachash means to be led astray through deception. To be tricked by someone operating at a level of sophistication you were not prepared for. It is the word you would use for a fraud victim. For someone who trusted a document that had been forged. For someone outwitted by a scheme they had no way of detecting. Eve says, the serpent Nachash and Oppos, me. The serpent deceived me. And then she says, and I ate. There is no self-pity in that sentence. There is no excuse-making. There is, actually, a kind of bare honesty that is almost painful to read. She does not say, but I didn't and Oppos, no. She does not say, but it seemed true at the time. She says what happened. The serpent deceived her, and she ate. She owns both halves of that sentence. Here in Oppos. That's what most people miss, and it matters for every single woman who has ever been handed Eve and Oppos' story as a verdict on her own. Paul writes about Eve twice in his letters. Once in 2 Corinthians, once in 1 Timothy. And both times, when he talks about what happened to her, he uses a Greek word, exopateo. The prefix X is an intensifier. This is not light deception. This is not a moment of confusion. Exhipateo means to be thoroughly, completely, expertly deceived. It is the word you use when someone has been deliberately, skillfully outwitted. Paul and Apos. S argument, in the text that has been used for 2,000 years to limit women in church leadership, is not that Eve was stupid. Paul and Apos. S argument is that Eve was deceived. And his concern is that the same thing could happen again, that the Corinthian church, that the Ephesian church, could be led astray by a deception as skillful as the one that came for her. He is not saying, women are the problem. He is saying, sophisticated deception is the problem. And it has a history. Now I want you to think about what you have been told about Eve. And I want you to ask yourself, honestly, whether what you were told was the text, or whether what you were told was already an interpretation, a tradition, a conclusion that someone arrived at before you ever opened the book yourself. Because there is a detail in this story that almost nobody includes when they teach it. Adam was there. Go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. She took the fruit and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her. Who was with her? He heard the conversation. He watched the whole thing unfold. And he made his choice, not from deception, Paul says, but with full information. Adam was not deceived. Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Adam knew exactly what he was doing, which means the one who acted from deception was Eve, and the one who acted with full knowledge, clear-eyed, aware, without being tricked, was Adam. So why does she carry the heavier sentence in the way this story has been told? Why is her name the one used to explain why women cannot be trusted with their own spiritual judgment? Pay attention to this, because this is not a small question. The Church Father Augustine, one of the most influential theologians in the history of Christianity, wrote about Eve in the City of God, Book 14. And he said she was not yet confirmed in virtue when the deception came, that she was spiritually immature, and that reading has shaped 2,000 years of interpretation. But here is what most people do not know. Augustine also said that Adam and Apos' sin was greater. That sinning with full knowledge, as Adam did, was a more serious transgression than being deceived. Augustine said both things. History remembered the first one. And so for 20 centuries, Eve has been the emblem of female unreliability. Not because the text says so, because someone stopped reading halfway through. There is something else. Something that gets buried under all the blame and all the doctrine and all the ways her name has been used as a warning. When the serpent came to her, he came with a theological argument. He challenged what God had said. He offered an alternative interpretation of the command. And Eve, this woman who has been called naive, gullible, weak, Eve engaged it. She quoted the rule back. She added the detail about the middle of the garden. She reasoned through the serpent and Apos' claims. She evaluated the fruit on 3 separate criteria. It was good for food, pleasing to the eye, desirable for gaining wisdom. She was not impulsive. She was thinking. She was deceived by a being the text itself calls the most cunning creature in existence, using an argument sophisticated enough that it has required theologians to spend 3,000 years unpacking it. 3,000 years. And you are going to call her stupid? You are going to say she should have known better? She was lied to. By an expert liar. Using a theological argument designed specifically for her. In a world where she had no frame of reference for what a lie even felt like. Because nothing had ever lied to her before. Not once. In her entire life. The situation is ancient. But the feeling of being told you should have known better, of being blamed for what someone else did to you, of having your failure held up as evidence of your fundamental untrustworthiness, that feeling is not ancient at all. That feeling is this morning. I want to stay with that for a moment. Because if you are a woman who has ever been handed someone else and Apos' verdict on who you are, someone else and Apos' interpretation of your choices, your past, your failure, you already know this weight. And Eve has been carrying one for a very long time. Here is what the church has done with her name. In early church writings, she became the reason women were required to cover their heads. Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, called woman, end quote, the devil and Apos' gateway, end quote, and cited Eve as the source. In medieval theology, Eve and Mary were constructed as opposites, the fallen woman and the perfect woman, and every real woman was measured against both and found lacking in both directions. In certain traditions today, the story of Eve is still taught as the foundational reason women cannot be trusted with spiritual authority, because look what happened the last time one of them tried. That is a long time to carry something that is not yours. And here is the part nobody tells you. The word that Paul uses for what Eve experienced, exipateo, is not used in the Bible as a disqualifier. It is used as a warning about the reality of sophisticated deception, a warning that has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with the fact that the enemy of human souls is exceptionally good at what he does. Paul uses the same word in 2 Corinthians 11 when he is writing to the entire church, not just to women, to everyone. He says, I am afraid that, just as Eve was thoroughly deceived, your minds may be led astray from sincere and pure devotion to Christ. He is not using Eve to shame women. He is using Eve as a case study in deception, as a warning to the whole body. You were never meant to read that text and think, that is why she cannot be trusted. You were meant to read it and think, that is why we must all be careful. Because the enemy of our souls has been practicing this since the beginning. The Greek word for what the serpent was in the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, is phronimos. Phronimos means prudent, wise, shrewd in the best possible sense. It is used of the wise virgins in Matthew 25. It is used of the wise steward in Luke 16. The serpent was not described as brutish or obvious. He was described as the kind of opponent you would not see coming. And Eve did not see him coming. Because how would she? She had never been deceived before. There was nothing in her experience, no accumulated knowledge of lies, no catalog of manipulation tactics, no scar tissue from past betrayals, that could have prepared her for this. She was the first human being to be deceived, which means she had no framework for recognizing it. She was not weak. She was first. There is a difference between being the first person to encounter a kind of harm and being the kind of person who invites it. There is a difference between being deceived by an expert deceiver and being fundamentally untrustworthy. There is a difference between making a choice under false information and making a choice with clear eyes, and the Bible is not confused about this distinction, even if the tradition has been. Now let me show you something else that has been buried. In Genesis 2, verse 18, God says it is not good for the man to be alone, and he will make a helper suitable for him. The Hebrew word is ezer. And ezer has been translated as end quote, helper end quote, for most of English Bible history, which carries, in modern ears, the sense of assistant, support staff. But look at where else ezer appears in the Hebrew Bible. Psalm 121, my help, my ezer, comes from the Lord. Psalm 46, God is our ezer and strength. Moses names his son Eliezer, my God is my ezer, because God delivered him from Pharaoh. Every other time ezer appears in Scripture, it refers to God, to the strength that saves, to rescue from a superior force. And that is the word used for Eve. Most translations render this word as end quote, helper end quote, when applied to Eve. When applied to God, those same translations render it as end quote, strength end quote, and end quote, deliverer, end quote. She has been called assistant for 2,000 years. The actual word is rescuer. After the fruit, after the conversation, after everything has cracked open and the air in the garden has changed in a way neither of them can name yet, God comes. And the first thing God says is not a verdict. It is a question. End quote. Where are you? End quote. The omniscient God, who formed the stars and named them, who breathed life into dust, who knows the number of hairs on every human head that will ever live. This God walks into the garden and asks, where are you? He already knows. The question is not for his information. The question is for theirs. Where are you? Where have you gone? What has happened to you? The first words God speaks to humanity after the fall are not punishment. They are a search. He is looking for her. In a culture where women were property, where their testimony did not count in court, where their names rarely appeared in genealogies, where their suffering was largely invisible to the official record, God goes looking for the woman. He goes looking for the man too. But he goes looking. This is what I planted at the beginning of this video. The 7 words Eve says that almost no one ever quotes. Here they are. After the judgment has been spoken, after the serpent is cursed, after the pain of childbirth is announced, after the ground is told it will produce thorns, after all of it, Adam names his wife. And he names her Shava, Eve. The word comes from the Hebrew root che, life, the living, the one who lives. Adam looks at this woman, in the worst moment in human history, standing at the edge of everything they have lost, and he names her the mother of all the living. And she accepts it. She does not name herself for the fall. She does not name herself for the deception. She does not name herself for what she ate, or what she broke, or what the serpent did to her. She is named for life. And in Genesis 4, verse 1, the first words out of her mouth after leaving Eden are, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." With the help of the Lord. In the middle of exile. In the middle of death. She invokes the name of God in a birth announcement. She is the first human being in the Bible to do so. I think about the women I know, and maybe you think about the women you know, who have been handed a verdict. Not from God. From a tradition. From a misreading. From someone who stopped reading halfway through the text, and built a theology out of the part they understood and ignored the rest. And those women have spent years, sometimes their whole lives, carrying a name that was never meant for them. A name that says, "You are the problem. You cannot be trusted. You are the reason things go wrong." And I think about Eve, standing at the edge of Eden, receiving a different name. Not from the serpent, not from the tradition. And she does not argue with it. She does not correct it. She simply steps into it, and then opens her mouth, and the first thing she says is, "With the help of the Lord." There is a woman somewhere right now, maybe it is you, who has been told, in so many words or in very few, that what happened to her was her fault, that she should have been stronger, that she should have known better, that her failure reveals something fundamental and disqualifying about who she is. And I want to say, as clearly as I can say anything, that verdict was not from the text. It was from someone who did not finish reading it. The Bible does not say Eve was weak. It says she was deceived, and God came looking for her, and she named herself for life. So let me leave you with 3 things before we close. The first, the Bible is careful about the difference between weakness and deception. It uses specific words for specific things, and those words are not interchangeable. Weakness is one thing. Being deceived by a skilled deceiver is another. And a tradition that collapses the two has not been faithful to the text. It has been faithful to a conclusion that was reached before the text was fully read. The second, every verdict that was placed on you by someone else and oppose, deception is not yours to carry. If you were lied to, manipulated, led astray by someone who had more information than you, more skill than you, more experience in deception than you had experience in recognizing it, that is not a permanent statement about your character. That is a statement about what was done to you. And those are not the same thing. The third, and this is the one that stays with me. Eve did not name herself for the fall. She named herself for life. In the middle of death, in the first moment of exile, standing at the threshold of everything she had lost, she received a name that pointed forward, not backward, not to the fruit, not to the serpent, not to the conversation she should have ended differently. Forward, to every living human being who would ever draw breath. Shava, the mother of all living. She did not let her worst moment become her permanent name. And neither should you. Here is my question for the comments, and I really want to hear from you on this one. What is the one word you were handed about yourself that you are done carrying? Just one word. Leave it below. You might be surprised how many other women are putting down the same thing. If this video met you somewhere real today, share it with someone who needs to hear Eve and Apos' story told differently. And I will see you in the next one. She named herself for life. In the middle of death. I think that tells you everything you need to know about who she actually was.